Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Hope you've all had a wonderful day. Today's video is a book date. So basically a book date is a book update on my reading challenge of 2019. If you haven't seen that video, I will leave a link to it in the description bar down below so you can check that out. Basically, I have picked 19 books to read throughout 2019. So this was the first book I read. It's the Brady and Hindley Genesis of the Moors Murders by Fred Harrison. So this is the specially updated edition. So there is a older one which doesn't have the epilogue and a few other bits at the back, whereas this one does. So this one took me about 5 or 6 days to finish, I think, because I was sort of reading it on and off. But yeah, this video is going to basically tell you what I thought of the book, what my thoughts are about this in general. So yeah, it is going to have spoilers in it, so that is a pre-warning now. If you don't want to hear about the spoilers, then I did enjoy the book, but I have some issues with it. So that's all I'm going to say for those of you that don't want spoilers. For those of you that do, let's get into the video and I will tell you what I thought. So, yeah, Brady and Hindley were the Moors murderers. They kidnapped and killed 5 children, basically, if we're going to crunch it all down to complete basics. Now, these two have always really interested me. I know that sounds quite strange, but I picked this book because one of the questions for my 19 books was a true crime book. And as these two have always really interested me, I thought this would be a good one to read and to sort of find out things maybe I didn't know about them already. So yeah, the book begins talking a lot about Ian Brady and sort of what happened at the beginning of his life and the things that sort of possibly had a knock-on effect to him doing the things he did and having the views he did. He was very, you know, he believed that the Nazis had good ideas, what they were sort of implementing was the right way to go about things. And it says he already killed a few people before he went on to the children with Myra. But obviously nobody really knows if that's true. He was never caught for those, so they're potentially things that he just created. Obviously he met Myra and he sort of describes that they just had an instant connection. And from what I gather, she felt the same. She was sort of in love with him, under his spell, some might say. And eventually they worked together to kidnap and then kill 5 children. So there were 2 bodies that were never found. Pauline Reed and... I've forgotten his name. It's really bad. Where is it? I can't find it. I might come across it. But yeah, the first 2 children they killed, one of them was Pauline Reed, and the other, I'm going to have to find it because it's really bothering me. Keith Bennett. Keith Bennett was the second person they killed. And those 2, their bodies were never found, which has sort of haunted their families, I imagine, for years and years. And I think what bothers me most about it is that they had many opportunities to sort of come out and tell people where the children were buried. I mean, they found 3 bodies and a 4th that Ian killed, and he actually like axed them to death. I think the downfall, which is very clear in this book, was that they invited a 3rd person in, a David Smith, and he couldn't cope with what had happened, basically. I think he'd had a bit of a terrible upbringing, so they'd sort of invited him in thinking that he would... I think Ian wanted to create a cult, and they'd invited David in the hope that he shared some of the same views, and I think they tried a little bit to sort of gauge what he felt and things like that. And when it came down to it, Ian says, you know, David Smith just wasn't up to killing. And I think, you know, that's the reason they were caught out. David went to the police and he told them that Ian had killed somebody, and he was pretty sure that they'd killed other people. They were in prison for 20 years before Myra started to sort of speak about what had happened and things like that. Ian had always taken full responsibility. He tried to get Myra off at their sort of court hearing and things like that right at the beginning. He sort of said she was there but she had nothing to do with it, stuff like that. And for majority of the time, Myra she stood with that story. And then police and reporters and things sort of tried to knock them off of each other, if that makes sense, to try and find out more information. With Myra, it worked because after 20 years, she felt so guilty that she wanted to help. But for some reason, Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett's bodies were never found, whereas Ian believed that there was no redemption. He was never gonna, you know, he felt that by unearthing that, people weren't going to have closure. It was better to just leave things in the past where they should be. That was his view. I personally think that in order to redeem themselves in the smallest way possible, after 20 years, the least they could have done was to share where those children's bodies were buried, or even disclose what happened to the bodies. So, you know, if they'd sent them off in a river or, you know, burnt them or something like that, just so that the parents and the families could have that closure. But Ian didn't believe that anyone needed it, didn't believe that it would help anyone in any way, which I think really bothers me, because I think if you are capable of doing something like that, then if after 20 years you can't see that you should maybe try and make some sort of redemption, then that's kind of a big deal. But yeah, I mean, they are both dead now, just in case anyone didn't know. Myra died first. I think she was like 40 something, and she died of heart problems in prison. She'd been trying for parole the entire time she was in there, without success. And Ian, he never wanted to get out. Never ever wanted to get out, and he often went on hunger strikes and things like that because he wanted to be transferred to a mental hospital. A lot of people believe he wasn't mentally or criminally insane, that he was just mentally disturbed, not quite right, and he needed like specific help and support in order to get him out of the mindset and the views that he had and things like that. But because obviously back then the Home Office had to look at opinions of the public, how they felt, things like that, he never, until much later, he never made it to a mental hospital. He never made it there because, you know, the Home Office didn't believe that it was right, considering the families that had suffered. So he went on hunger strikes, made himself very, very ill, and then at last he did get transferred, but yeah, he died very recently, and unfortunately the two bodies were never found, which is really quite upsetting. But I mean, this was a really interesting book to read. It gave quite a big insight into the two of them separately whilst also together, gave a lot of background on them and David Smith, the young teen that sort of they tried to get involved. It gave a lot of background information, but not an awful lot of information about what really happened, because obviously the only people that know are here and weren't willing to disclose for whatever reason. I mean, Myra refused to, you know, accept or confess that she had anything to do with the murders until 20 years after she'd been in prison. And then after she'd said that she had something to do with, after she confessed to Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett's murders, she then retracted it and was like, no, I had nothing to do with it. So nobody really knows. I personally feel that Ian wasn't sane. I personally feel that there was things going on inside his head that he wasn't able to cope with, and by killing he felt that that was a release. And by feeling like that and meeting Myra, he got her involved, and because of her love for him, it all sort of happened together. A lot of people think that she was in a shadow the entire time, whereas on the other side, a lot of people think that she was actually the mastermind behind it all, and she sort of said, you know, we'll take these fantasies of yours and make them a reality. I'm not really sure how I feel about that. I do think a lot of it was Ian, but you can't tell me that 5 children were killed. She knows exactly where they were buried. They took pictures. She was involved in voice recordings of them being abused. It's just not possible that she wasn't involved at all. So I think for me, the only issue was there wasn't enough information about what really happened, but the only people that know that are those two. So, you know, Fred Harrison, although he went to visit Ian many times in prison, there's only so much he could get out of him. He said that Ian was a very tortured soul, and even it was very difficult to make sense out of the little things he did disclose. So while I thought it was a good book, just didn't give enough of the right information for me, but there's nothing anyone can do about that. I did like the fact that they had included some images. So they've got the map of Gorton, which was sort of where they lived, and it sort of gives numbered markers of where the children lived and where they were taken, supposedly. Keith Bennett, there he is there. Little one never found. And then obviously the 2 of them on the day of arrest. There's Pauline Reed up here with her brother and Pauline's mum. There was a lot of fact in there, and a lot of sort of information about what sort of went on. There's some pictures here of David Smith. So he obviously was sort of inveigled in because of his background with violence and things like that, and the relationship he sort of had with Myra's sister. So they thought he would be a great addition. But obviously a lot of people believe he was more involved than just coming upon Ian axing this child to death, as he waited about 3 or 4 hours before going to the police. But I suppose a lot of it could have been shock, you know, not knowing whether it's going to be good or bad to disclose it, what's going to happen, things like that. But he still continued to go up onto the moors with the police and look for the bodies of the children that they'd already killed. He sort of wasn't around them when the killings of the other children were happening. He sort of came onto the scene a little bit after. But he still helped to look and to try and find them. Went up with sniffer dogs and things like that, but unfortunately, you know. But then I also wonder, maybe after 20 years, do they even remember where they buried those 2 children? Is it, I mean, they're on the moors. You know, you might go up there one day with the body in the boot and think, oh, this is a lovely spot, we'll bury them here. And then you drive off, and how do you know your way back? You just don't. So I think there's a lot of unanswered questions, but at the same time, you know, that's what happens with true crime. Unless you get complete full disclosure, no one's going to know anything. And these 2 just weren't going to tell us everything because it wasn't in their interest. Ian knew that if he disclosed everything, that Myra would be horribly implicated, and Myra refused to admit anything because she wanted to get out on parole. So there's their motives behind not disclosing anything. I think it just would have been nice before they both died to give that relief and that closure to families. But all in all, I did enjoy the book. I probably wouldn't read it again because obviously I've read it and I sort of know it. There was a lot of flicking backwards and forwards between different parts, so it'd sort of start off with Ian as a boy and him growing up and sort of coming up with these sort of views and opinions and things, and then it sort of flicked to Myra and a little bit about her. You don't hear very much about her growing up, and then it would flick on to David Smith and then back to Ian as a sort of young teen. So it did get a little bit confusing, but all in all, not a bad book, and I'm glad I have finished it. So yeah, that is book 1 for 2019, and I have started book 2, which is Jojo Moyes After You, which is the sequel to Me Before You. So yeah, that is everything from me. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope, although it was very rambly, that you kind of got a bit of an insight into the book itself. If you've read it, let me know what you thought, or if you've got any opinions on these two in general. I'd love to hear sort of your views and your opinions on it. Let me know in the comments section down below. Take care. I will see you guys very, very soon.